So I think this is an excellent subject to be involved in at this conference and talk about supply disruptions to the supply chains. And we've had a lot of very useful and informative presentations today. I want to focus a bit more on one of the major causes of trade disruptions that we face, and that's dealing with technical trade issues, standards, and regulations. And while a lot of the points have been covered, I thought for the first bit I might go over a bit of where we are at and where we're likely heading, and then get into a bit of what are some of the things that we can do. And I don't know if I call them policy options, but some of the ways forward that we may want to look at. I'm putting this slide up simply because last year I had an opportunity to work with May Young, Bob Kerr of the University of Saskatchewan, and Brian Christie out of the U.S. on a report on maximum residue levels sponsored by the Canola Council of Canada. And what we tried to do there was look at three aspects. We looked at the scientific and technical issues around establishing MRLs, and then we looked at the trade policy implications around MRLs, and then looked at did a literature review on the academic information that was out there, with the goal of trying to come together with some ideas on how to move this forward. And again, Gord mentioned a lot of this earlier today, so I'm not going to get into it, but clearly MRLs is a significant issue that needs to be addressed. It's been clearly shown here, but also I'm pointing this out because a lot of the stuff that we did in this thing and some of the conclusions we came to really apply to almost all other technical issues, genetically modified foods, plant and animal health issues, and so on. So I'm going to try to speed through these, but clearly, as mentioned earlier, I don't want this to sound too pessimistic, but it's not pessimistic. It's just kind of where things are at right now, where they're headed. But we do have a lot of technical issues out there that are causing greater and greater market access disruptions. Different standards exist for different commodities. There are variances in standards amongst countries that create non-tariff barriers that are difficult to overcome. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a move away from international standards. Years ago, when we had the GATT, and then we developed the SPS agreement and the TBT agreement, and so on, there was great hope that we could start to resolve all of these things internationally. Of course, we had the international standard-setting bodies, but over the years evolved, while those bodies are still relevant, there's going to be more of a go-it-alone kind of approach to dealing with technical trade issues. And unfortunately, these tariff issues, or these technical issues, standards and regulations that impede the trade, they're costly to everyone, really from the producer right through to the consumer throughout the whole value chain. And they have implications for food safety, food security, and the costs associated with those things. So as mentioned earlier, again, we have a wide array of misaligned and missing standards. And again, I refer back to Gord, did an excellent job of pointing out the issue around missing standards with MRLs. A lot of times, trade problems arise because standards have not yet been developed and maybe are not a priority for development, particularly for the importing country. Countries deal with risks, how they manage risk mitigation, risk management, risk communication differs by country. That is extremely challenging for exporters to keep on top of and to know what changes are happening. Establishing new regulatory regimes or changing regulatory regimes is an ongoing day-to-day thing and change rapidly. And again, as mentioned earlier, there are multiple government agencies involved in every country, and what may come as a surprise, sometimes government departments aren't always on the same page. And so trying to crack through that can be difficult, and particularly when often there is a lack of transparency. And so sometimes that transparency in an importing country can be accidental. Sometimes it can be deliberate. You're required to be transparent under the WTO, but some countries do things and don't necessarily want to broadcast exactly what they've done. So it's a very complicated malaise of issues that we're dealing with. I would say probably, as I said earlier, we had the international standard-setting bodies recognized under the WTO. Standards set by Codex, the OIE, and the IPPC are deemed to be in compliance with the WTO, and therefore encourage countries to do them, or use them. But I'd say that their role is waning. They've over the years, kind of procedures and processes have been long and arduous and slow and taken years to develop a standard. Now we've seen some progress in recent years, say, for example, with Codex trying to streamline the 8-step process and be able to put, for example, an MRL in place much more quickly than it could before. Consumers don't understand international, or I'd say lack an awareness of the international standard-setting bodies and what they do and how they work. So when it comes to protection from on food safety and other things, they look to their own domestic governments and organizations to protect them. And unfortunately, what's evolved over the years, and experience has been, seen this in all parts of agricultural trade, is the increasing political influence on science. And, we've seen this, and I can think of going back, how long ago it was when we had our first case of mad cow's disease in this country, and we immediately lost 45 export markets for our beef sector. And over the time, it took years and years to get those markets back, and still there's some we haven't got back. But countries, the science was there. The OIE developed science and protocols around the import of, around dealing with BSE, but still countries were too scared to do anything, or politicians were too wary about doing things because of the domestic political pressure. So science kind of gets pushed aside, and we have to deal with the reality of the politics. And, I wrote down here, but in my notes, but I don't say, but often politics can trump sound silence. I shouldn't have used that word, maybe, given what's ahead. Okay, so where are we today? Where are we at? Again, we have trade agreements in place. I mentioned, and they can sometimes play a role, but they have their limitations. The SBS agreement in the WTO is a good agreement. It sets out the rules very clearly in how trade should be handled, and how science and trade should be brought, regulations and trade should be brought together. But it also gives a lot of flexibility to countries to do whatever they want to do. And that line in there about countries establishing their own level of protection, and they do not have to explain why that's their level of protection, but they can just do it. It gives countries a lot of leeway to do whatever they want. We have dispute settlement processes in place under the WTO, of course, and others that can be used to try to challenge those technical issues and respond to them. But again, the dispute settlement processes can be long and arduous and very costly, and are not always easy. And particularly when you're dealing in areas involving science, it can be even more and more difficult, because when you have a case goes before a panel, the panelists tend not to be scientists or regulators or whatever. They tend to be trade policy people, but they rely on scientific expertise from outside. And unfortunately, people on both sides can go out and dig up some scientific information to back up their case. So it's very difficult then sometimes for those panelists to weed through all that, and it can go on, and we've seen that happen with hormones and salmon and other things like that. So where are we heading? Well, probably the proliferation of divergent standards is going to continue. Producers and the exporting supply chain will need to stay ahead of the game, which will be a challenge. My personal view is, I think, and Jill Hobbs mentioned this this morning, is that we are seeing more and more of a domestic focus increasing and more of an insular look. And we've certainly, with Brexit, we're seeing movements now in various countries in the EU where there's this focus to go back to just the member state and all of that. We've got the new administration in the U.S. who's very clearly gained a lot of votes by talking about getting rid of trade agreements and how trade agreements aren't working. There's a lot of misconceptions about trade agreements and how they work, and unfortunately, I think in many cases, countries see them as just losing jobs. They don't see how they can gain jobs. They don't see the benefits, but I think we're heading back. So I think we're going to see more of this, and this is going to be a bigger and bigger challenge to overcome. And unfortunately, as we try to also bring wealth to the developing and least developing countries, they're going to face the greatest challenge here. Ellen has referred to some new technology and products. That's clearly, as we get into those, that's going to present new questions and new challenges that we'll have to deal with. We talk about MRLs and GMOs and veterinary drugs and animal and plant health things and so on. There's a whole array of things, and it's going to be so important that it is important that we try to get out ahead of these things so that we can maintain consumer confidence and not have to deal with it much like we've dealt with for years now with GMO products and trying to allay the fears that have been, in my view, unjustly perpetrated over many, many years. What role will trade agreements play? I don't know. I mean, the TPP was a very powerful agreement. We don't know the outcome of it, but it doesn't look good at this point. Is that going to mean that people are just going to say no more trade agreements, and we're just going to focus on our own country? The consumer information wave is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have in dealing with these issues because, as we all know, and it's also mentioned earlier by Ellen, is that this wealth of information that people are getting is really critical. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. It creates perceptions and misperceptions and so on. And that increases the risks of more politicization. So what can we start to think about what we can do? Well, I think we need governments to start to recommit to rules and science-based trading system. Let's get back there and have a system out there where we follow the rules and we base our regulatory decisions on science. We need to do more to streamline the domestic and international regulatory process I mentioned earlier in Codex, but also domestic processes within our own borders need to be strengthened as well. The capacity of international standing setting bodies need to be enhanced. A lot of bodies like Codex, they rely on member states to provide the human resources and the research capacity and so on to get towards the establishment of standard. Well, as governments all over the world are reducing and cutting back and so on, it's getting harder and harder to dedicate these resources to the international standard-setting bodies, but it's something that I think we need to look at, and I know Pulse Canada and others in Canada have done quite a lot of work on that very thing. And again, I always think it kind of makes sense because if you can adopt an international standard and you can set an international standard, you don't have to go through all the scientific process and regulatory processes in your own country. You're freeing up the resources within your own country to do other things as well. So there seems to be some kind of common sense, in my view, on that. And we need to, again, move towards the adoption of those international standards. There's a lot of opportunities, I believe, for collaborative international cooperation whenever possible. Governments and industry to meet in international fora all the time within organizations like the WTO, the OECD, APEC, and so on. There are all kinds of opportunities for informal, formal, bilateral, whatever discussions to try to move things forward. And again, it's that resistance to not go it alone. My last slide, so I'm getting there, Richard. I'm sorry. Key to all of this stuff and moving this forward is getting that national government support. Obviously, federal governments, Trade 101 are responsible for negotiating trade agreements, rules, opening market access, and so on. So if you don't have your governments and the ministries of those governments on board, it's almost impossible to move that forward. You struggle to get those issues to the top of the priority list in governments. And to do it before there's a trade stoppage. A trade stoppage is way too late because by then the trade is stopped, the cost is being incurred, the damage, as was pointed out earlier, with the example of glyphosate, lingers on and on and on, and it's too late. So, it only seems to me that it makes sense to try to figure out what the problems could be and get out there and do them. But, unfortunately, I think governments tend to be more reactive sometimes than proactive. It's nice to be able to say that when you've retired and left. One of the last things I'm going to mention is we referred to a couple of times the low-level presence process, and just so some of you may not know what that means, but unfortunately, one of the last things I worked on before I left the Department of Agriculture was about a year-long project to bring 15 countries together to deal with the low-level presence of GMO products on crops. So that these are very trace amounts of crops, but with new technologies, new testing technologies and so on, they're very easily to pick up, and some countries, as soon as have zero tolerance, and pick it up, and the shipment is stopped, and dozens of examples. It's not a food safety issue, it never was, and so we tried to build a group together to get a kind of an international movement about how we could deal with this. And so we did, and Canada led it, and we had very good interdepartmental cooperation, and we had very good industry government working relationships. And industry government working relationships, and when I say working, I don't mean just talking, I mean practically being in the same room and working together can be the most successful work. And we had that. So, we did that. We arrived at a level. We agreed that for food, not environmental release, that if a crop was approved in a country with a recognized regulatory system, it should be allowed to others. So it overcame the silos, and I think the last thing, and it's the hardest thing, and I just throw it up there because I don't know why or how you do it, but there's that constant resistance to change out there, and finding ways to overcome that won't go away. So I'm going to stop there because I'm over time, so thank you very much.